My name is Diana Buds, and I'm a design journalist. And joining me today are Senator Cordell Cleare, who represents the 30th District, composed of Harlem and Washington Heights, and is the chair of the Committee of Aging. And then to her left is Ronda Wise, a preservation consultant, member of the board of Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts, and the former executive director of the Landmarks Commission and Land Use at the Department of City Planning. And then Caitlin Waickman, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation at the New York City Department of Housing and Preservation and Development. And we're going to start off with each panelist sort of sharing a little bit about their background and why they're interested in historic preservation and rent-stabilized housing. And then we'll go into a Q&A and have some time for questions at the very end. So to kick things off, Senator Cleare.
Okay. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I just want to thank you for inviting me here this morning, especially Save Harlem Now in my district, Morningside Heights. I am New York State Senator Cordell Cleare. I still consider myself an activist, but my activism really took flight around my work related to childhood lead poisoning prevention, which is a health issue, but it's very much a housing issue at the time. Always living in Harlem, which suffered a lot of abandonment and neglect, which is how children were able to get lead poison through the deteriorated paint that was in those properties. So I always think that, you know, my beginning roots was around housing, and certainly I was part of some of the first movements towards low-income co-op, TIL program, urban homesteading is how they began. But I represent some of the greatest neighborhoods in the state, no offense to anybody else. The 30th District covers Morningside Heights, which is Harlem, but you know.
My apologies for the misnomer.
And they call it the Upper West Side, but you know. And I represent Central Harlem, West Harlem, East Harlem, El Barrio, a very significant portion, and a small piece of Washington Heights. And these are all historic, diverse, incredible neighborhoods, different yet the same. And that is why I am really interested in housing, because housing makes neighborhoods. The ability for you to stay in your neighborhood and live in your neighborhood, and future generations to come back home or to continue living and build families, that's what maintains our neighborhoods. So that's very important to me, and that's why I'm interested in preservation, because I know that preserving our buildings is not just about preserving the beauty and the architecture and the history, it's also about the legacy and the future.
Thank you. Rhonda?
Thank you also for having me. And, you know, my background is at the Landmarks Commission, City Planning Department. I'm a consultant now, but I'm really here because I live in Yorkville, and every time Frampton sees me at a hearing, I'm screaming about what's happening to Yorkville. So that's why I'm here. So Yorkville is a laboratory of what should not happen in terms of housing. I have three words that I want to talk about very quickly: preservation, numbers, and ecosystem. So preservation, I would like to just talk about with a small p, okay, that preservation really needs to be part of any sort of housing problem that we have. For 50 years, the city has seen hospital buildings converted to housing, hotel buildings converted to housing, walk-ups converted to supportive housing, and yet now every time we hear about the housing crisis, it's all about new, new, new. We need to demolish and have new. My second issue, again, this is all really Yorkville, are numbers. So the city talks about the housing crisis, which we all know we have, and they talk about the need for 10,000 units, 100,000 units, 60,000 units. Now, if there was a dearth of $2 to $3 million apartments on the Upper East Side, this is the greatest plan, because that's what's happening right now. And these people are finding spots to live, and it's just great. However, if you think that housing, that the housing needs will be just filled by housing, if that's your mantra, then my question is, why on a lot of these sites is there a net loss of housing? Because the new apartments are very large and they're replacing smaller apartments. So the net loss of units is obvious. In terms of numbers, which I have not yet seen from the city and which Nuha and Zainab have provided from Friends of the Upper East Side, is the fact that just on 5 random sites in Yorkville, we've lost 220 affordable housing units and innumerable stores. And this is something that I have never seen figured into the city's plan. And the third point, which these two lead to, is the ecosystem, which is critical, right? We all move to neighborhoods in New York City because we like the neighborhood. We like interacting. We agree with Jane Jacobs, eyes on the street. And this ecosystem is being destroyed because the small units are leaving. When a store leaves, the people who work there leave. And I was photographing the corner of 86th and First Avenue because it was demolished very, very fast. It was a whole bunch of row houses on the corner. And a guy came over to me, a young guy, and he said, "What are you taking pictures of?" I told him. He said, "I was evicted from York Avenue and 86. They put up ultra luxury senior housing." And he said, "Now I'm living on First Avenue. I know I'm going to be evicted." He said, "I feel like there's no place for me in New York, right? I can read the writing on the wall. I'm moving back to Ohio." Nothing about wrong with Ohio, but nevertheless, this is somebody who was not making a ton of money, who wanted to put down roots here, and he can't. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Rhonda. And for our panel's representative from the city, Caitlin, I'd love to hear a little about, your background and your work.
Of course, yeah. Hi, everyone. Caitlin Waickman. I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation at New York City's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD. I really appreciate being included on this panel today. I'm here because of my interest and my work around rent stabilization and my work on the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, the NYC HVS. The survey is sponsored by the City of New York and has been conducted since 1965. It's a really important source of data for the city that also establishes the city's official net rental vacancy rate and is the only representative source of data on rent stabilization in New York City. The survey is really valuable on a wide range of things and is designed to be representative of New York City's housing stock and population. So I'll be talking a little bit about findings from that today, but would also point you to our initial findings that have a lot of information on rent stabilization and are available on our website. So I know a lot of people here today are very familiar with housing in New York City, but just as a reminder for everyone, New York City is a city of renters. 2/3 of New Yorkers rent their homes, and about half of those renters live in rent-stabilized units. So there's a lot of need for affordable rent-stabilized housing, and while our housing stock does continue to grow, for decades now, we've had a very low vacancy rate in New York City, including in 2023, the lowest vacancy rate to date of 1.41%. So there is a real need for stable, affordable housing in New York City. And this is where I think my intersection with preservation really comes in, because rent-stabilized housing is a really vital portion of our housing stock that provides stable, affordable housing for a lot of New Yorkers. Rent-stabilized units are generally in older buildings built before 1974, and a lot of those are pre-war, and they're in buildings with 6 or more units. So I think this is a housing stock that's really essential for us to think about and its role that it plays in New York City and for New Yorkers who might otherwise struggle. So excited to have this conversation today.
Super. Thanks so much. And I briefly introduced myself, but I'll just say a little about me. So I cover design and architecture for publications including Fast Company, The Architect's Newspaper, Metropolis, and Dwell. And I am a tenant in a rent-stabilized building, and that's sort of one of the reasons why I was interested in this conference, and has sort of experienced many of the challenges facing these places with deferred maintenance, with sort of landlords who are often trying to push folks out, and I think that, for me, I was just sort of even thinking back to my experience in housing, and rent stabilization has helped me live in places like New York and San Francisco and be a journalist. So I think that it's important for folks to to just get a sense of like who is able to be in a city, to Rhonda's point, based on these policies. And so today you'll hear about cooperative housing, NYCHA, you'll hear about SROs, and our particular focus is on this like really small subset within this larger ecosystem of housing, which is rent stabilization in older buildings. And so it's like this conversation about historic preservation might make folks think about landmark buildings, but really it's this aging building stock. And there's a sense that tenants are feeling like, you know, we're not getting the level of housing that we require. Landlords are sort of saying, you know, we don't have enough money to be able to afford these buildings. And there's a sense that it's not working on both sides. And so we're hoping that our conversation today can kind of help us figure out, you know, what is a path forward? How can we sort of even just get a better grounding in this conversation, since there is a lot of like misinformation, I would say, conflicting information, and a lot of interests that are behind some of these numbers. But to start things off, Caitlin, I'd love if you could give us a little bit more of a lay of the land. You mentioned what buildings are typically rent stabilized, but you know, what is the definition? How is this different from rent control? Tell us about the numbers. Who lives there?
Yeah, I would love to. So I already talked a little bit about rent stabilization. These units are generally in older buildings with 6 or more units. Of course, units can also be rent stabilized through affordable housing or through tax incentives, but the vast majority, about 75% of rent stabilized units, are in these older buildings. And so that's about 1 million units, housing about 2.5 million residents in New York City. Rent stabilization is different from rent control, and it forms, rent stabilization is the vast majority of rent regulated units in New York City. So that's what I'll be focusing on today. And rent stabilization is tied to the unit itself and not to the tenant, which means that when a tenant leaves, the unit is still stabilized, which means that rent stabilization not only is an incredible resource for its current residents, but is a long-term form of stable housing in New York City over time, which I think is a huge component of it. But rent stabilization does serve New Yorkers who might otherwise struggle in the market. Tenants of rent-stabilized units are typically older, lower income, more likely to be non-white, and live in their homes longer than residents in market units. I know that rent stabilization can seem complicated, and the laws have changed a lot over the years with different incentives and different rules around the increases, which are determined by the Rent Guidelines Board via a vote. But I do want to highlight the recent changes in 2019 with HSTPA, which had a real impact on the on rent stabilized units and how they function today. Those laws made quite a few changes, but I want to highlight that one thing was the removal of large increases at vacancy, which could have a big impact on changes in rent in between tenants. And also the elimination of vacancy decontrol. So units now no longer exit rent stabilization after reaching a certain rent threshold and someone moving out. So now they stay within that rent stabilized system. That's a really big deal. And even though it's no longer in place, it's something that should be on our radar, because prior to 2019, 170,000 rent stabilized units exited the system through vacancy decontrol. And while we can build affordable housing over time to stem that tide, that's an important loss of units that are long-term stable housing for New Yorkers who need it most. So I think a really important change that happened in 2019, and something that I want to highlight for all of you. I've probably talked a lot, so I'm going to stop now, but I'm happy to talk more about rent stabilization. I'm clearly very excited about it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess, you know, Senator Cleare, so I'm curious a little about how, you know, rent stabilization has sort of impacted the districts in which you work, and how have they sort of like fit in with this overall ecosystem of affordable housing? And tell us a little about, you know, how it shaped your region.
Sure. So I want to thank Caitlin for that comprehensive explanation. And the HSTPA had to be passed by the state legislature because of what they had done to the rent stabilization laws prior. And that is how we lost those 170,000 units of housing, was because landlords were allowed to deregulate apartments. And I think when those laws were passed under Pataki, and this is why it's so important, who's in office and, and who you're voting for, you know, everyone said, oh, we're just going to make it be deregulated at, I think it was like $2,500. If the rent goes up to $2,000 or more, then it'll become deregulated. And rents were maybe, you know, $300, $400, $500 at the time, $600. And everyone said, oh, it'll take forever to get there. It happened overnight almost, especially in communities like Harlem. There were very unscrupulous landlords and others who found every way possible to deregulate apartments. I moved into an apartment in a building that I grew up in. I knew every tenant that ever lived there my whole life. And the rent that I was charged for that apartment was 3 times what the rent was supposed to be on that unit. Had I not grown up in that neighborhood and I not known that after I signed my lease and knowing the process to go to DHCR, it was DHCR at the time, and contest this, if I had not done that within a year of moving in, guess what? It would have become the law no matter what, even if they were wrong. So the laws were really all screwed up. How many people know to go to DHCR? How many people know they have to do it within a year's time? That's like, you know, if you rob a bank and you get away with it for a year, you're good. So a lot of those laws had to be changed to make it so that tenants could, you know, fight back, and legal aid, even right to counsel is impacting now, us fighting for right to counsel, how much of this rent stabilized housing we could keep. It's very important that we keep rent stabilized housing. This is how most of the workforce in New York is able to be here. This is how most people are able to raise families. My neighbor here talked about, you know, all the luxury apartments that go up. You know, one thing that has never happened to me, and I've been doing this for about 35 years, no one, not one person ever anywhere in my district has walked up to me and said, you know what, Cordell, you got to work on that luxury housing, you know. You know, we really need those luxury units, you know, but every hearing and whatever I go to, I'm told, you know, oh, but we need different kinds of housing. We need more housing. Our current governor right now, I'm saying you can't just say build housing. You can't just say that. That is not going to solve the problem. We have all kinds of foreign speculators, people who are coming in, buying these units, no matter what the price is. So you have to designate affordable housing for people in New York, and rent stabilized housing is a part of that housing. We have to make sure that we protect it. There are other things that we need to do. I have a bill, because something that's happened also is that buildings do get torn down and they get destroyed. You know, we have, not in my district, but you know, the new Penn Station, a lot of housing was torn down for that. Rent stabilized housing. And I have a bill that I'm saying, for every unit you destroy, that unit should be replaced, whether it's somewhere else. We have to build back that housing stock. We lose a lot of buildings, you know, to fire and to different things, and when they get torn down, what gets built there should reflect the units that were destroyed, because that is something that has become a problem in my district. I'd like to see, one of the other things we had to do also, speaking of rent stabilized housing, once all these apartments became deregulated, so now you had all these tenants who moved in and they're paying market rent and there's no cap. So what happened? You had landlords who were just getting as much as they can. You may face a 50% rent increase, and there was nothing you can do about it. So this legislature passed last year good cause eviction, which is another form. At least it's something that tenants can go and complain with. They can go back. Up until then, there was nothing that you could do. That's why it's important to keep rent stabilized units, because people are going to go for, unfortunately, as much as they can get, as much as they can rent it for. Stabilization helps give them a little bit of a guideline so that you can go up, but you can't go up but so much. And that is very necessary in order for us to keep people in New York, to keep working families in New York, and to keep the people that are in these neighborhoods in them. And right now, what I'm facing is just, it's really, I often say this to people and they don't get it. It used to be funny a little bit, but it's really not. You know, in my community in particular, we raised our children, and I was raised this way too. Stay out of trouble. Do your best not to get into trouble, not to get into the justice system. Go to school. Go away, go to school, get an education. Come back and give back to your community. We have at least 3 generations who have done just that. But guess what? They've done everything, but they can't come back. There is no place for them to come back. There's no room for them. And that's not just. That's not fair. Our young people should be able to come back to Morningside Heights. They should be able to come back to Harlem. They should be able to come back to El Barrio, and especially in certain neighborhoods because they've come through a struggle. They've made it out. They have the answers. I need them not just because I want them there. I need them to be my teachers. I need them to be our doctors, our social workers. I need that talent. I need that to come back to our neighborhood. So rent stabilization is so important when you talk about ecosystems. That's the ecosystem that I'm worried about. Where are my future community leaders, my business owners, my entrepreneurs, the people who know this community, the people who are culturally familiar? Where are those people who care about our city? They can't come back because we're losing so much rent stabilized units.
Yeah, and just to put a few numbers behind that, I think that the market rate median rent for available units in the city is around like $3,700 to $4,000, while rent stabilized apartments, I believe, are around $1,500 a month versus $1,800 for market rate. And so that's like what people are actually paying, and it's a huge difference. So thank you so much, Senator Cleare, for sharing just a little bit about like the community preservation role that these older buildings play. And I wanted to shift a little bit about to the buildings themselves. And like one of the things that we're trying to do is sort of acknowledge this overlap that these units are in historic buildings, and we're not necessarily talking about rent stabilization and historic buildings together. And Rhonda, I'd love to hear a little about why this is sort of an important thing to do and sort of what you're seeing in the buildings themselves. Like, what are some of the challenges related to like the architecture, the preservation? I'd love to hear a little about your experience there.
I say ditto to the
Thank you.
right. So when people, and I'm not talking about you, but other people in the administration, when they hear preservation, they feel that we're a group of obstructionists, and we're not. We really want to be the partner of planning, because I feel that planning is up here and preservation is down here, looking at the buildings, looking at how these communities work and how the buildings interact. For us, we always hear, oh, it's a shame that those 8 buildings came down, but it was as of right? As of right. And people act like as of right is like the weather. It's like the rain. As of right can be what the city says it is. So, for example, if you are demolishing affordable units, you have to put them on site, or you have to somehow create a fund so that the buildings that are left right next door are going to be able to stay whole. I mean, I think that for us is an issue, that the city doesn't see this as an issue. I think if this, we can come up with 100 different possibilities of what we can do, right? We can say you should only build luxury buildings, you should only build new buildings in areas that have school seats, that have sufficient parks, that have sufficient infrastructure, right? That's all part of planning. I think that to everybody's point here, some of the owners are really they're very careful about their buildings. A family has a couple of buildings. They want this sort of generational wealth. They want to hold on to their buildings. People like having a landlord they know. They don't want to have an elevator. But if it's so tough, the question is, what can the city do? Preservation, the landmarks Landmarks Conservancy has a revolving fund for certain landmark buildings. There are grants. Why can't this be baked into somebody, does a zoning lot merger, they buy 10 buildings, they've demolished them, they're going to make a fortune, people have moved away, they've taken care of the people in regulated buildings, but what happened? What happened? Why can't this be part of the as of right for either certain districts, certain building types, certain demolitions?
Great, thank you. And one of the things I'd love to hear a little about is sort of just the financials that are really involved in just the maintenance and repair and getting some of these units that are not necessarily up to habitability, like into the rental market. And I think that we've been hearing so many things these last few years about units that are too expensive for landlords to repair. They're claiming that they're too expensive to repair given like the rent that they're legally able to charge. We've been hearing things about units just disappearing from the rent rolls. I'd love to hear a little about just this this sort of feeling that rent stabilization is really actually preventing housing from being on the market in these older buildings. And Caitlin, perhaps you'd like to speak a little about this since you've been doing some of these vacancy reports and sort of like really getting a sense of the data that's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I'm glad that, we're thinking about all together. I think that, of course, when we talk about rent stabilization, we're specifically talking about older buildings that have special needs when it comes to maintenance, and we should be thinking about everything that we can do to make sure that the tenants who are living in these units are living in safe and habitable conditions, of course. However, when we look at our data and we know that there are concerns out there, we do find that rent-stabilized units are being occupied. I mentioned the 1.41% vacancy rate in 2023. That was less than 1% for rent-stabilized units, far less. And when we looked at our data over time between 21 and 23, any units that were offline in 21, 75% of them were occupied by 2023. And when we're concerned about specifically, I think you're talking about these units that were very low cost, and there's concerns that landlords might not be able to just in a financially reasonable way bring them online. In our data, we see evidence of very few of these units overall. In 2023, when we looked at units that were renting for less than $1,500, which Diana pointed out is the median rent for rent-stabilized units in general, and were offline for more than a year and were not under some sort of renovation, we saw just about 1,700 units citywide. And so we really don't see evidence of this widespread units offline in rent-stabilized buildings. That's not to say that there shouldn't be, we shouldn't be thinking about all the tools available for landlords or anyone responsible for buildings to make sure that any unit that can be online is available, especially for New Yorkers who need it most, of course. And so that's why rent stabilization does include incentives for apartment and building level maintenance. But I do think that we also want to recognize, the merits that come with rent stabilization, specifically in these older buildings, and the role that it plays in the city.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Sure.
In Yorkville, and I don't know other neighborhoods, these affordable units, and some of them stabilized, some of them just affordable, right, have been demolished now for well over a decade. So I feel that those numbers are, the fact that they're gone is also harming the vacancy rate, right? We're not sort of figuring in those affordable units that have been demolished over the last, say, 15 years. So, that's just something I think for us to think about when we think about the vacancy rate.
Sure, yeah, I think the overall housing stock, I can't speak to Yorkville
No,
specifically, of course, but we want to be thinking about, any unit is something that is valuable towards thinking about the housing crisis
Right,
that we're in.
absolutely.
Do you have anything to?
I would only add to that the legislature increased the amount that landlords can use to bring these the vacant units up to code? Because we were hearing that people, okay, they're offline because we can't afford to bring it up to code when people leave. And I didn't, I'm sorry, I don't have the amount, but considerable amount per unit, right, to bring these apartments up to code. But, you know, there's, of course, this isn't the rule across the board. I really think it would be beneficial if, in some way, we could look at the books of some of these buildings, because, you know, I just, you know, there's not the same number of cold days every year. You know, you're not doing the same things all the time. You don't do a roof every year. You don't do a boiler every year. You don't do elevators every year. You know, what is happening? And for the most part, I see tenants take care of where they live. There's not all this. So I think we're at a disadvantage as the public, you know, and even government. We listen, but I think we should really like see what is it that you're facing that's so hard. Uh,
And yeah.
to deal with. I mean, of course, small landlords, I understand definitely, you know, some of our brownstone owners, family owners that may have one, you know, 3 units or 4 units in their building, but we're talking about people sometimes who have multiple buildings, many large buildings. And I'd like to see, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a recent report from the Rent Guidelines Board that said revenue had increased, I think like 12% over last year compared to like maybe 2% from the year prior. And I mean, like, what? Yeah, that brings me to one of my questions is, you know, what don't we know about these buildings that is preventing meaningful change? And I can, if anyone wants to jump in.
I already said what I don't know. You know, I just don't understand always. Let me not say I don't believe, but I don't know that it's always accurate. And the other thing that I don't understand, and I get different answers from different people. Every time I ask somebody, what does it cost to renovate an apartment? I mean, you can't believe what I get, because when we were talking about allowing our commercials to be converted and so forth and so on, I tried to get a good understanding of what it costs to even build a unit. And I got everything from $250,000 all the way up to $1 million.
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous, because you can never get an ROI on that $1 million, you know, if you're investing per unit.
Yeah.
That just is unreal. So that's something that I think we need to know and we need to look at, just what it costs to construct and what it actually does cost to maintain some of these units, so that we could get a better sense related to this. And I know you want to stick to the rent stabilization, but, you know, because we don't know this, you know, I'm asking the state right now. I have another bill. I say we need a social housing authority. We need a housing authority. Okay, don't be afraid by the name social. It's okay. We need somebody that's their job to build affordable housing, instead of us running from developer to developer, trying to develop product after product, tax incentive after tax incentive, and none of it works. None of it is any good. 421A built on displacement. So let us get an agency that the state has the power to zone and rezone. They don't have to deal with that. They have access to land. They don't have to deal with that. They even use eminent domain for people who need it, like Columbia. So why can't, if we're serious about this, why can't we have that agency that develops affordable housing for our workforce and for our low-income New Yorkers and for our seniors, who is the fastest growing population in the state? Why don't we do that? And it's about political will to me, what people want to do and what's important and what you make them do and what you press for them, what you press for us to do. We work for the people. We're public servants. This doesn't have to be mysterious. It really doesn't. You know, there's a way. There's a way to do this. So that's what I add to that.
Definitely. I mean, the cost thing is interesting. And just as an anecdote, like I was in an apartment where they did sort of individual apartment improvements to try and essentially get the unit above that rent stabilization threshold. And I did call in and say, like, what did you spend? And they're required to outline. And I was like, oh, you chose the top of the line appliance. You chose like these materials. Also, I know you worked on multiple units. Like, there's no way that this is the cost for this. You batched like materials. And so, yeah, that was something that I was just very curious about the real numbers that are involved in some of that. But I guess, that, yeah, go ahead, Rhonda.
We have a couple of professors here, so I think this would be a great project. Take an existing building and go through and say, what would it cost, really cost out everything? What would it cost to bring this building up to code? I think that would be a great project. And I also question, again, talking historically as I do, where are the Vanderbilts? Where are the Carnegies? Where are the philanthropists like that who really contributed? I mean, Vanderbilt built housing, in Yorkville. And there were all these people who may not have done so much good, in their work, but they were very committed in a lot of ways. And that's a piece of this that I don't understand. I don't understand why one of these people, you know, couldn't fund, a sort of a one building. Like, let's see what this building will be, right? Whether it's for supportive housing or, something else. And then that will be a model and we can take it from there. I want to say on 86th Street, we have supportive housing, 28 units next to a bagel store. Nobody, it's in a walk-up. There has never for 1 second been a problem there. It has been a perfect neighbor. A lot of these buildings could be used for that. A little bit here, a little bit there. You build a neighborhood that way, right? And we're not seeing that. So I am wondering, again, not the city, where are those people? And they're not at the conference, but Frampton, maybe you
It
can.
might be.
If you are, come on up.
Totally. I mean, yeah, like you're saying that there is a lot that can be done with the existing building stock instead of sort of thinking that, let's let it just deteriorate to the point where we're just going to eventually tear it down instead of thinking about ways to use it.
Yeah, and one thing I just want to add, I'm going to keep probably harping on 2019 is something that had a huge impact on my work. But there were some big changes in 2019 related to those individual apartment improvements and major capital improvements. That's apartment level improvements and building level improvements in rent stabilized units that came along with both time and amount limits for as well as certain reporting requirements that didn't exist prior to 2019. I won't go too much into nitty gritty, but I do think that thinking really intentionally about how we can incorporate incentives for quality in rent stabilization, but also making sure that we're thinking intentionally about how this may impact and being careful about how it may impact tenants like you long term is really important. And those changes in 2019 were a big part of that, I think.
Right.
I could just add one other very important level to this is the preservation community. And when you're talking about buildings being worn down and run down, again, and I hate to be the cynic here, but I've seen where people have allowed these properties to go down deliberately, so to the point where they do have to be destroyed so that they can do what they want. So we have to strengthen laws, and thanks to groups like Save Harlem Now, again, I'm mentioning, where we have gone out and tried to save these buildings from going, because what you described earlier, once one goes, the one next to it, and the one next to it, and the one next to it. And sometimes that's a larger plan where people are looking at profit at the end. They're looking at how they can build. We do have to get in and do things like many of you have done, create the historic districts to protect, create the landmarked buildings to protect these spaces. And one important thing and how it relates to affordability, again, this was a question I asked when I said, well, if you're converting, you're not starting from scratch. How is converting more than starting from scratch? How is that? Which no one has ever explained to me. But I believe if you already have a structure, it's easier and it's certainly less material that you're worried about, where we're just renovating what we already have or building in what we already have instead of tearing it down and starting something new. So I think that the work that the preservation community does is very important to try to preserve neighborhoods and the buildings that we have that are really well built by comparison to anything they're putting up now.
This is not about Yorkville, but George Calderaro and I have tried to get some articles published about the reuse of hotel buildings. Because there's a whole bunch of hotel buildings that were emptied. They're sitting, you know what they're waiting for. They're waiting for, you know, the demolition, and they would be perfect housing, right? I used to live in a converted hotel building. There are so many, you know, we have such a history of this in the city. And again, why it's not a city priority. Years ago, when we talked about greening everything, they said, you know, an existing building is greener than new construction. And so that I don't hear that mantra anymore. So the question is, why are we not privileging the preservation aspect of our city? It would, you know, these buildings are there, they're near public housing, you don't have to redo anything. So we don't know, but nobody would publish.
No.
I think we're at an interesting moment, sort of thinking about environmental goals related to the city and to its building stock. And so we have programs like Local Law 97 that are sort of emphasizing energy-oriented retrofits. But yeah, to your point, I do think that there is just sort of a pressure to build new. I think a lot of the city's economy is based on building new, and a lot of the conversation around sustainability has also focused on like construction-focused work. But I'm curious, it seems like there are, you know, more programs that are potentially out there for landlords who do want to rehabilitate their older buildings, but maybe they just don't necessarily know about some of those things. And I'm kind of curious, like, you're sort of saying like a little skeptical glance, but I'm curious, like, is there an issue of like, you know, trying to just get more landlords aware of tax credits, programs, subsidies that might be available for, you know, if they just have a mind shift of like, I have a historic building versus, you know, I have a rundown building. I'm curious, do you think that would help at all, or is it?
I guess. I mean, you know, for some reason, I get a certain publication to my house every every quarter. There's a certain group and it's really comprehensive about every single credit law, regulation, thing, lawyer, loophole thing that anyone would want to know. I haven't told them, you know, that I'm not a landlord yet because I like to read it. I like to see what they're thinking, but somehow it comes to me. I think maybe one of the organizations I dealt with made them feel like I'm a developer or something, but it seems they're informed. I think this.
Kind of want to get this publication now too.
I'll tell you about it, and when we finish. But not. It's one of the largest real estate groups in the state. They're a huge lobby. The people I'm very concerned about are the really small landlords. Maybe they do not know. I think smaller landlords do need more information and more support. And especially, I think somebody mentioned it earlier, with some of these properties, these are older people. These are older New Yorkers. And they really need that kind of help. And I've been trying to help some of my few homeowners, older people, because taxes are an issue for them, and we have to continue to increase tax incentives for them in terms of property taxes. Repairs are a challenge for them, small things. We have to really see what we can do to support them in that regard. And even having a bad tenant, because there is such a thing. Even having bad tenants, working with my colleagues to see how we can help small landlords, especially our seniors who sometimes get taken advantage of or abused by people who move in. So I think, yes, the answer is yes to our older folks. They may need some more information, but they're not the ones that we're so worried about that have the problem.
And the tax credits for historic buildings, need to be in historic districts, National Register districts, et cetera. And so while they're very useful programs, I'd say that particularly in Yorkville, we've watched as whatever, that was a great, great 2 blocks. Well, now, there's not much left in terms of the architecture. So that's a problem. They're available. I mean, and I think there are many people for whom it's available who don't know about that, but you have to be
And
deemed
just
historic.
on the architecture, now not to overtalk the preservation of everything, I remember like maybe early 90s, throughout the whole 90s, or 80s, 90s, there were all these buses that were coming into our community with people taking pictures. We didn't like that at all. We knew something was wrong with it. But they were coming and taking pictures, and I started watching them. They were taking pictures of the architecture and how beautiful it is in our community. And that's a reason, that is an economic development issue. That's a tourism issue. Nobody's coming here to see another glass and steel building. People are looking for that beautiful look that's in many of our neighborhoods that we couldn't recreate if we wanted to right now. So I think that's something that's really important, and New York City should look at it as, that's what makes us different. That's what's so beautiful, that we have neighborhoods. Everything doesn't look like 34th Street or 42nd Street or Times Square. You don't want everything like that. You want to have these beautiful low-rise, to a little bit higher, nice, beautifully crafted buildings with all the scroll work and all the historic stuff around them. So I think it's another reason why it's really so important for us to continue.
Great.
And I think to your point also, zoning is a huge piece of this because, we always had the mid-blocks on the Upper East Side as lower scale and the avenues were higher. And now the mid-block zoning is being chipped away so that, for people who don't have weekend houses and who don't have, who need light and air, these neighborhoods are becoming very difficult because it's difficult to see the sky, right? And so I think it's a real livability issue for the rest of the neighborhood as well, when you completely, building by building, just destroy what's there, the historic and the low scale and the variety, right? We had high, we had low, we had a variety of stores, the stores are gone.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes.
Yeah.
The interesting shops,
The local
right? The
shops.
pickle store,
Yep,
all those kind of
Candy
wacky,
shop,
right?
yeah, candy
Yeah.
shop.
I mean, that's an important thing too, just thinking about, like these buildings they're mixed use
Right.
in many ways. I guess I think my final question would be, what would each of you like to see happen next in this conversation about rent stabilized units and historic buildings? Caitlin, maybe?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's exciting just that we're sort of here talking about rent stabilization and historic preservation together in the first place. I think that it's important that we be talking about rent stabilization, clarifying what it is, making sure that both people doing work here and residents in these buildings know about rent stabilization and the rights that come to tenants with rent stabilization as well. So I am mostly glad that this is happening. Yeah.
Interesting question. I think rather than going to city planning all the time and city council and complaining about City of Yes and all these other projects, I think I want to be a city planning commissioner so they can hear it from me.
Yes, yes.
Out of retirement.
Yes. I love that. And I think we should look at that rent guidelines board and who gets on it and how many get on it too, because I think sometimes it's really unrealistic. But I'd like to see what should come out. We have to organize, and this is a catch-all for everything that's going on right now. We really do have to organize. Some neighborhoods do it better than others. Some blocks do it better than others. But it's all about organizing and educating the community. We need to have tenant associations. There's strength in that. There's information in that. There's protection in that. Tenant associations, trainings to make sure people understand. I'll give you a good example about this. I watched some people move in, to buildings in the neighborhood. Of course, after my experience, I started asking people, what are they charging you? Everybody didn't share that, but some people did. And I said, well, you should really go check that at DHCR because that may not be the right rent that you're supposed to be paying. Some people did it. Some people were like, oh, go away, you're bothering me. I knew what I was getting into, so I could pay it. I could afford it. And they did. But some people did not know. They did come in and they didn't know and they didn't know. And they were so happy and grateful that I was able to give them that information. I just passed the bill in the Senate. I hope that it flies, but it is to allow people who are looking for an apartment to get the rent history on that apartment. Right now, you have to be a tenant and you have to, go and find out. You have to have a lease already to go find out what was the rental history on your apartment. But I think that when people are looking to rent an apartment, I think that would help level the playing field. Okay, 1 minute left, she says. And then I just want to shout out that on the education piece, and thank you for reminding me, Valerie, I do fund forums to talk to homeowners to make sure that they do know tax incentives, what's out there for you, legal help, assistance that you can get. So we, in my district, I make sure that we do that annually, and I think it's probably coming up soon. But organizing trainings and also participation on these boards, you triggered that in me too. We need to have more people from the community that represent these entities on these boards.
Great. Thank you. And now we're going to switch over to Q&A from the audience. So if anybody has questions for our panelists, Frampton is coming around with a mic. And Frampton, I will let you choose. Since you have the power of the mic.
Thank you, panel, and thanks to HDC for hosting this conference. My name is Gib Vaconi. I'm with the Prospect Heights Neighborhood Development Council, and I'd like to maybe propose 3 ideas. I'd like to hear the panelists' feedback and maybe HDC's feedback as well that we could do here. I think there's just a lot of politics. Obviously, we all know that associated with the intersection of preservation and affordable housing. And so my 3 ideas are this. The first one is it possible for us to amend the charter of the Landmarks Commission so they would consider the historically rent-stabilized apartments in buildings that are proposed for designation as part of a district or individual landmarks? Our organization had experience trying to designate buildings like this, multifamily buildings with rent-stabilized units that were only built to 50% FAR on their lots. And I believe we had lots of, I won't get into that all, we had lots of good backup for this, but ultimately LPC turned us down. And I can't help but feel the city wanted to see the development potential of those sites preserved. Can we get the Landmarks Commission to acknowledge that the preservation of a diverse income and rent level in these buildings is itself something that helps make our neighborhoods what they are? The second idea is, can we pass legislation, perhaps at the state level, to require developers that demolish a building in order to redevelop at greater density to replace the rent-stabilized apartments that are removed at the same rent levels they were when they were removed? I know these are all big political lifts, but from a messaging point of view, they would help break down the whole problem that we have about trying to defend preservation as something that's somehow bad for affordable housing.
That's my bill.
If we can show that they're lying, great. I want to find out more about it and support it.
I mean, I think that to your point, it is like political advocacy, trying to organize and build more of a coalition around some of these issues, and those are all like very interesting ideas. And we don't have anyone on Landmarks officially on our panel to answer that, but
it's not part of their mandate, right? The cost of things, and
But economic development is part of their mandate, for instance. So it's not all just about architecture, right? So let's look at that and see if there's something we can do.
I remember, Liz, I don't work there anymore, but I'll tell you, friends of the Upper East Side, we are turned down all the time. We submit, requests for evaluation, and we are turned down all the time.
Yeah.
So you're not alone.
All right. Thank you.
thank you for your comments. I appreciate it. And
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ann Bush, and I'm from Clinton Hill in Brooklyn, which is landmarked back in the 80s. I'm actually president for the Society for Clinton Hill. And we care a great deal about preservation. I'm also the owner of a 5-story, 9-apartment, rent-stabilized building. And I love it. However, there are expenses every year that come out of the blue, in addition to new inspections that need to be done, if not annually, every couple of years or whatever, and there's always something new. You could have a laundry list of things as to why we don't have $10,000, $20,000 sitting around in a savings account to do whatever we need to do. And no, we don't charge tenants for every little thing. Caitlin, you keep saying or referencing the incentives about rent-stabilized buildings. If you're just talking about tax credits, is that all you're talking about, or is there something else that I'm missing?
There's the IEIs, the MCIs, and then other programs that I can speak less to, just because that's not my
Okay,
area,
so
but
let me
yeah.
just say that one of the things that I want, not only for myself, but for the other people in the neighborhood, are low-interest loans, either grants or partial grants, or programs that they can get into so that they can actually maintain these buildings. Because some of mine is 1890. So, you know, you're not talking, and I just finished doing the front of the building. That was close to $100,000. And I don't have money, okay? So the people that have less than me, and then you want to know why their stoop falls down or the parapet, that's a new inspection we have to get in. And I'm not saying we shouldn't get it because you don't want the buildings falling down. But there's got to be some type of incentive for, or help, support, put it whatever way you want it, for the owners to take part and do it so that it doesn't mean they have to sell their building and leave. The other thing I want to say, and somebody brought this up, one of the panelists brought it up, the buildings that are purchased that are left to deteriorate. That is an ongoing problem. I have people reaching out to me right now in the district that are talking about a church that was purchased by a developer over 10 years ago. It's still sitting there.
We do that.
And it's deteriorating. So what happens? The landmark says rip it down.
Yeah.
That could be a great use of space for supportive housing, affordable housing, whatever, recreational space, centers for the community, the children. No, it's just going to be a luxury tower when they rip it down. So something really needs to be done in terms of monitoring.
As you know, I don't work at Landmarks anymore, but I do think it's important for Landmarks to hear from people with these practical issues and questions, because I think it will help Landmarks also with their regulatory framework.
And thank you for that. And you're absolutely right. We do need to help smaller buildings, smaller landlords, people who are doing the right thing, who want to do the right thing. And it is difficult. I do appreciate that. And that's something we're working on to do.
Good morning. My name is Valerie Bradley, and I'm president of Save Harlem Now. And before I ask my question, I'd just like to thank Senator Cleare for funding Save Harlem Now to hold these workshops in Harlem, East, West, Central Harlem, for small homeowners to give them information about tax credits, low-interest loans, and other kinds of incentives that help them maintain their houses. And this was brought about because of the fact that even if a property is landmark, we're experiencing in Harlem, and I think it's a citywide problem, that the buildings department is demolishing buildings that have been neglected, even though they're landmarked. And that's a serious issue. So it impacts us as preservationists if we're working to preserve a neighborhood, and in the process of that, preserved buildings are being knocked down. It's, you know, like working against ourselves, it seems. One of the things, this is not about preservation so much, or it could be. New buildings, especially that come into my district, are taking advantage of the 421A tax incentives. And the tenants who come into these buildings aren't aware that the landlord is under 421A and that they are rent stabilized. And so like in the last 3 years, have moved to one of those buildings after selling my brownstone. And I've been telling tenants in the building, you should go to DHCR and see if you're listed as a rent stabilized apartment. And they found out that they've been grossly overcharged because they are rent stabilized. And I'd like to know if there's do we need some legislation to make new buildings inform their tenants that they are rent stabilized, and they're rent stabilized during the duration of that tax abatement that the building is getting? And that could be for like 20 years, right? Which would be of great help, and maybe if people knew that in advance, some of the young people that the senator talked about who can't afford to be in Harlem could afford to be in Harlem in these new buildings if they published the correct rents.
Yeah, I think information is super powerful, and there's a reason why it's very hard to find out some of these very basic facts about leases, about apartments. And thank you for those
I'll look into that.
suggestions there.
You can be sure I will look into that.
I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so thank you very much for your ideas about ways to address the issue. And I guess we've got a mic over here too.
Hi, I was wondering if you could address the substantial rehabilitation loophole for destabilization of buildings. Since we're talking about preservation of older buildings, some of them might need that. And also, are there ways that we can talk about, making preservation less expensive, whether it's dealing with lead paint or lead pipes, or a cornice that's deteriorated and fallen off a building? We want people to fix those things, but it's notoriously expensive. Anytime you say lead paint or asbestos, the quote goes up by 5 times. But there must be easier, less expensive ways to do it. Even if we can't pass laws, can we publish guidelines? Can we, I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking around how we can.
I think this all it's part of information, right? It's part of, I think what you're saying is critical. I know that the Landmarks Commission cannot tell you certain contractors to do work, but the Landmarks Conservancy can. So the question is, all these questions we're hearing about is like, how do we find out? How do we disseminate this information? It's there. Plus, I think you're also talking about, which what we've been talking about, is some kind of grant program, some kind of something to assist people to do the right thing. They're all great ideas.
Absolutely. I'm supportive of that. I mean, we do have to look at how we can make it less expensive. And yeah, people do become predatory when they hear certain words. So the price shoots all the way up to the moon. Oh, it's lead, you say.
Right.
It's asbestos, and suddenly it becomes very, very expensive. So, yeah, I mean, I get your point, and we need to look at a way to help bring that cost down and make preservation not so scary, right?
Yeah, that does seem sort of like a little bit of a regulatory issue, like on making sure there isn't price gouging for specific things, which can be challenging when there's a trade involved, and it's just like time and labor. But thank you very much for that comment. And I think we have time for one more question. Yes. I guess she's coming there, I think.
Hi, I'm Peter Bray. Senator Cleare, you mentioned briefly property taxes. And I have a 3-family brownstone in Brooklyn. My property taxes are 2 to 3 times higher than a lot of my neighbors' property taxes. So It's a 125-year-old house. So my question is that I think property taxes are a horrible way to fund government operations and services. It's regressive. I know that the state had instituted some sort of millionaire's tax within the last 10 years or so. It seems to me that the tax system can play a big role in this. And I know that there's a lot of politics behind it. Every time you hear talk about the millionaire's tax, it's like, oh, well, if it's increased, you know, all the
Yeah,
wealthy
they're
are
gonna-
going to move out of New York. That could actually be a solution, I think, to our housing problem.
Okay.
You know, but it seems to me that, you know, there ought to be a better way of raising money to pay for things in New York City, that there could be potentially a housing pool of money established by the state by dedicating a higher millionaire's tax
Come on.
to pay for this, so that we're not completely reliant on developers developing affordable housing.
I couldn't agree with you more. It is my, you know, and of course, there's a limit to, you know, I'm looking, tax the rich, you know, they have a responsibility in this too. Most who live here have benefited greatly from this city. They have benefited in all kinds of ways. You know, I'm baffled every time I walk past Madison Square Garden and think they pay no taxes. I don't understand that. It just doesn't, you know, anyway, you're right. And we should be looking to that to help a lot of things, to do a lot of things in this town. If we really know, if we really believe there is a crisis, and there is a crisis and more to come. And even in terms of, just really quickly, I chair the Committee for the Aging, and I'm always saying we have to build housing for seniors, right? That's going to help alleviate things. There's a lot of seniors who have lived in these apartments. They have raised their children. Time's up. They've raised their kids, and you know they want a smaller place now. They want someplace less expensive to live in. Some of them, even though rent stabilized, it's what they're paying is above what they're getting at this point for whatever their income is now. So I'm saying building for them creates apartments that now we can have families move into, and others in our community. But we have to make sure that we are doing affordable housing. We have some of that in the budget coming out. Hopefully it made it into the one house, and I hope that it continues. But we have actually, what we did with the governor's City of Yes money is we have allocated much of it in certain areas to say where it has to go. Supportive housing, senior housing. It has to be, we need affordability. We can't just build a housing. We just can't just do that, because that's not the makeup of our city.
Thank you, Senator Cleare. Well, appreciate you joining us for this panel. Thank you for joining.